Once upon a time, there was a little princess named Susan. Susan lived in a beautiful castle surrounded by a vast garden filled with flowers and trees. One day, she decided to explore the nearby forest. She put on her lovely white dress, placed a small crown of flowers on her head, and set off on her adventure. The forest was full of tall trees and wildflowers, and the birds sang sweetly. As Susan walked joyfully, picking flowers, she gradually drifted farther away from the castle. After a long time of wandering, she realized she was lost. Susan tried to find her way back, but the more she walked, the more confused and scared she became. She sat down under a large tree and began to cry. As she cried, she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up and saw a small deer gazing at her with its wide, gentle eyes. The deer seemed friendly, so Susan stopped crying and smiled at it. The deer came closer and gently nuzzled her as if to comfort her. Susan felt reassured as she touched its soft fur. Suddenly, the deer began to move slowly towards a certain path, and it looked back at Susan as if inviting her to follow. Susan decided to follow the deer, hoping it would lead her out of the forest. Susan walked behind the deer for a long time, and soon she began to recognize familiar landmarks. Gradually, the trees began to thin out, and in the distance, Susan saw the castle walls. Overjoyed, she ran towards the castle. As she neared the gate, she turned to thank the deer, but found that it had disappeared. Susan returned to the castle safely, grateful for the deer that had helped her find her way back. From that day on, Susan told everyone in the castle about her adventure in the forest and how a little deer was the reason she returned home safely. Susan lived happily ever after, surrounded by her family and friends, and she grew to love the forest more than ever, as it reminded her of the little deer that had saved her.